Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Jumong, the beast hunter, and so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Jumong is a long-range DPS champion who excels in dealing strong, consistent, as well as burst damage from afar with his bow and arrows. He has one of the highest basic attack damage in the game, and his basic attacks also have a very long range, and so this sets him up to be a very deadly ranged DPS champion in the right hands. He has very good survival abilities to help him survive longer and deal more damage, and he also has some decent control options as well to make it that much harder for enemies to get to him. Because of this, it can often be very frustrating when going against a good Jumong player, and so if you like to annoy your enemies, I guess Jumong is a good pick. Jokes aside though, I think he is pretty fun to play if you enjoy putting out a lot of pressure on your opponents, and the best part is I think that he's actually a pretty simple champion to play too. By that I mean his gameplay style and all that is pretty simple. Mechanically though, I think some decent mechanical skill is required to utilize him to his maximum potential, and so I think he is not fully beginner friendly, but just somewhat beginner friendly. So yeah, before we start, just like other champion guides I have made previously for Uldur and Taya, to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections, and I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Jumong's abilities, before talking about his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at his Battlerites options, and finally we finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Jumong. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about his abilities. Starting with his left click or mouse 1 ability, Hunting Arrow, this is his basic attack, and it is a simple ranged attack that deals quite a bit of damage. Successful hits with your basic attack on enemies or the central orb gives you weapon charges that can stack up to 3. 3 weapon charges allows you the ability to recast your mouse 2 or spacebar abilities after casting them the first time, and it is actually very important for Jumong's survival, and so we'll get to that soon. Having 1 or 2 weapon charges doesn't give any other benefits, and so you'll want to get to 3 charges as soon as you can, and have it at 3 charges as often as you can if possible, because it is so important. Moving on, Jumong's right click or mouse 2 ability is Steady Shot, and it is just a normal long cast time, huge burst damage range attack. Pretty simple. Because of its long cast time and it doesn't penetrate enemies like Jade's Snipe, it is mostly just used as a zoning tool or for getting the orb from 30 down to 0 in one hit, or perhaps when the enemy is stunned and you can get a free hit easily. As I mentioned when talking about the mouse 1 ability, you can recast Jumong's mouse 2 ability when you have 3 weapon charges, but I think that it is best not to waste the 3 weapon charges on this unless you know for sure you will not die in the next 10 to 20 seconds or so, since you typically want to save those weapon charges for his spacebar ability. Coincidentally, let's talk about his spacebar ability next. Jumong's spacebar ability is Black Arrow, and it is a dual function ability because it can be a survival or damage ability, depending on the situation. What it does is that Jumong dashes forward toward the direction that he's moving, while firing an arrow toward the mouse's target direction. While dashing, Jumong is invulnerable, and this is why it is a survival ability for Jumong, since it is very useful for avoiding damaging abilities. When enemies are close to dying, it can be used as an offensive ability as well, since it provides some decent damage and it can provide a bit of a gap close as well with the little dash, and so it's pretty versatile ability. You'll definitely be trying to recast this ability when you need to when you have 3 charges, but having said that, don't worry if you don't have a good use for the recast, since the 3 weapon charges will only be expended when you actually recast it, so you can use it only when necessary. Do bear in mind that the ability still goes on cooldown if you don't use the recast, so do be careful. Onto his Q ability. Jumong's Q ability is Prowl, and it is another one of Jumong's survival ability. Prowl removes movement impairing effects and increases Jumong's movement speed by 100%. During this time, Jumong can run into enemies to inflict the Seeker's Mark debuff onto them, hitting a basic attack or the arrow from Jumong's spacebar ability while the debuff is still up will incapacitate the target for a short while. This incapacitate is really handy for landing your other abilities, which we will get to later, so when it is safe to do so, you may want to use this offensively as well. Be careful that you are not invulnerable in the state, so enemies can still damage you during this time. Moving on, Jumong's E ability is Bear Trap, and what it does is basically Jumong will lay down a trap, and the trap will root all enemies when at least one nearby enemy walks over it. Because enemies can see the trap, they will tend to avoid it to prevent getting trapped in it. So using the incapacitate from Seeker's Mark is a good way to land your E, at which point you can continue to make free attacks on the rooted target. And so those were all of Jumong's abilities that doesn't cost energy. Now let us move on to those which do. Starting with Jumong's R ability, his R ability is Rain of Arrows and it costs 25 energy. What it does is arrows will rain down at a targeted location and enemies within the area will be snared and also be dealt some damage over time. Pretty sweet. The best part about the ability is that it has a very long range and it is an area of effect ability. It doesn't trigger counters, it can be cast behind walls, and it can be used to zone enemies, and it is also the perfect ability to use on an enemy that is trapped by your E ability. Very strong ability indeed. Definitely one of his best abilities, I would say. Moving on, Jumong's first EX ability is Seeker's Arrow, and this is his shift left click ability. It costs 25 energy, and what it does is that Jumong will fire an arrow that if it hits a target, it will turn around and hit the same target 2 more times. Each hit from this ability charges your weapon, and so this is a decent way of regaining weapon charges when you're in a pinch. This ability actually triggers counters, so it may not be ideal against champions with counters, but if you use it against champions without counters, it can actually be decent for some quick weapon charges. Personally, I seldom use it since getting those charges with Jumong's basic mouse 1 ability isn't the hardest thing unless you're being focused by the entire enemy team. Next up, Jumong's second EX ability is his Shift Q ability, Predation. Predation is basically an enhanced version of his Q ability and it costs 25 energy. It basically does mostly the same thing as his Q ability, but this time Jumong is actually invulnerable during the ability and he also deals damage to enemies he passes through that heals him for a decent amount as well. The most important part of the ability is the invulnerability, since it is essentially a get out of jail free card when you're stuck in a bad spot or you're about to get hit by a big damaging ability while your spacebar is on cooldown. So just use this ability and get out of there. Very handy. If you happen to pass through any enemies, you get healed for a little bit and you can even potentially turn the fight around since you can now incapacitate them and proceed to do even more damage to them. I would definitely rate this his best survival ability, so definitely try to use this over his normal Q when you need to and when you have the energy for it. And finally, Jumong's ultimate on the F key is Dragon Slayer. Basically what it does is that Jumong can charge up an arrow and the arrow will travel further depending on how long you charge, and it will also deal more damage depending on how long you charge it for. When it hits a target, it will push the first target it hits along with it, and if the target is pushed into his ally, another 30 damage is dealt to the second target and both enemies are stunned for some time. If the target is pushed onto a wall, the extra stun effect is also applied. The ability sounds very strong, but it's pretty difficult to land it since most people can see the casting and react accordingly. Even casting it for its minimum period is long enough for people to react, and so it can be unreliable to hit with it. Having said that though, it is pretty fun and it is also very satisfying when you do hit it onto an enemy. Killing 2 enemies at the same time with it to win the round is also the best feeling ever, as you can imagine. But yeah, if you're trying hard to win, then I highly suggest not using it simply and only use it when you have a guaranteed hit, since using your energy on your EXQ and R abilities is a better choice. Do note however that the arrow when fully charged does 60 damage, and so you can use it to guarantee the AWP for your team since it can deal 60 damage straight up. If you can hit an enemy at the same time as securing the AWP, then that would be absolutely fantastic, but I wouldn't count on it if your enemy is somewhat decent. Perhaps varying up how long you charge it when using it can make it just a bit more consistent. And so that's about it for Jumong's abilities. Now let us move on to his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Jumong's playstyle is a bit of a passive stand behind and shoot kind of playstyle. Only when absolutely necessary, like when an enemy is 1 or 2 hits away from dying, should Jumong perhaps try to jump in aggressively to finish him off. If and only if he doesn't have a teammate who is better suited for that, of course. Most of Jumong's damage will come from his mouse 1 basic attack, and so you typically just stand behind your other teammates and just try to safely poke at the enemies with your mouse 1 attacks. Occasionally, you can try to mouse 2 for some added burst if you feel you can safely do so, and use E and R to control enemies' positioning so that you can have an easier time hitting them, or stopping them from going for ops, etc. When you need to get enemies off of you or to avoid abilities, use spacebar, Q and EXQ abilities as necessary. I typically use my spacebar and its recast to avoid abilities or get away from melee champions who have gotten close first, before using Shift Q to get away when I absolutely need it since it does cost energy. Furthermore, you have full control of where you're going with Shift Q, and so it is more reliable when trying to position yourself nicely after escaping. So overall, pretty simple really. And that is why I think Jumong is very simple to learn. The harder part about Jumong is getting used to his, I would say, slightly awkward attack animation and timings, since it is quite different from most other champions. I personally had to take a while to get used to it since I play different champions all the time, but if you only play and main one champion and spend most of the time playing Jumong only, then it shouldn't be a big deal. So that was Jumong's playstyle. Let's talk about his strengths and weaknesses right now. One of Jumong's strengths is his ability to deal such high consistent damage from afar. Having a long range is very good since it gives you a big advantage over all other champions in that you can hit them at will but they can't in return. Having such a long ranged and hard hitting ability as his basic attack is therefore, I feel, one of his biggest strengths and why he is in such a strong spot in the game right now, especially once you get used to hitting with it consistently. Moving on, I think that another one of Jumong's strengths is his high survivability. His various survival skills, coupled with his long range, makes it very hard for enemies to try to effectively damage him, and so good Jumong players should be able to leverage these things that Jumong have and make him a real pain for the enemy team to deal with. Next up, I think that Jumong is also very strong at controlling the enemy's positioning. I'm not really talking about his ability to put out roots, snares and those sorts of CC effects, but what I'm talking about is his ability to exert pressure on his enemies. Because Jumong has such a long range and he can output so much damage from afar, he puts out a lot of pressure in a certain radius around him, and this makes it very easy to zone enemies away from each other when you manage to separate them. This is a very useful thing to have since your enemies being separated would mean that it would be more difficult for them to support and help each other out, and furthermore you and your teammate can then freely hit away at one of them while they struggle to regroup. So yeah, definitely a very strong trait to have. Moving on to his weaknesses, I think that one of Jumong's weaknesses is his lack of Battlerite diversity. Every Jumong almost will take about the same Battlerites because the Battlerites that he's supposed to pick are quite a lot better than the rest in their tiers, and so this can cause quite a bit of fatigue after playing the same sort of playstyle all the time. Furthermore, there will be very limited room for Jumong players to switch up their Battlerites as needed when perhaps faced with different opponent strategies and stuff, so yeah, I think that might be one of Jumong's weaknesses. Next up, I think that Jumong's pretty reliant on his weapon charges, and so this makes it one of his weaknesses. Until Jumong gets his 3 weapon charges, or at least some energy to use his EXQ, he is actually quite susceptible to getting bursted down since he doesn't have his spacebar recast and his immaterial from the EXQ. And so the best time to deal with a Jumong is at the start of the round before he gets weapon charges as well as some energy. Players who know this might make it hard for Jumong by just rushing him down once the round starts, and so you should try to be prepared for something of this sort happening. If you have a good teammate, then you shouldn't need to worry about this as much since they'll likely be able to help you out a little bit as well. And finally, I think that another one of Jumong's weaknesses is that until you can consistently get your mouse 1 hits in, he'll do almost no damage at all. Most other champions have multiple ways of getting some damage onto enemies, but almost every part of Jumong's kit will rely on his mouse 1 attacks, whether for energy or weapon charges, and so if you're against an enemy that's very good at dodging, or you're not very familiar with his attack speed yet, then it might be quite rough for a few rounds since he is entirely reliant on hitting his mouse 1s properly. So definitely practice getting used to those mouse 1s if you want to be great at Jumong. And so that's about it for his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Jumong's Battlerite options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerite if you wish before I go through my thoughts on his Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read them all, let's continue. In the first tier, I think that Heartseeker would be the pick most of the time. Jumong doesn't really have a lot of sustain in his kit, and so having a little bit of sustain goes a long way, since he can survive pretty easily already being so far away from his enemies most of the time. Having that little bit of extra healing makes up for the occasional mess up, and you need to heal up a bit of that damage. Hunter isn't really that great because it can be inconsistent to land those mouse 2s, and so you wouldn't really want to pick it when you compare it with the amount of usefulness that Heartseeker gives you. The only time that it may be okay is when you know that you can fully rely on your support teammate to keep you alive and you're up against all ranged enemies, since this would be a slightly more reliable way of getting the Seeker's Mark debuff on your enemies to incapacitate them. Serpent could potentially be useful if you feel you'll need to use your EXQ very often to avoid damage, but even then, because the EXQ takes up energy and you would need 3 weapon charges in the first place, it might be hard to consistently get value out of this Battlerite, and you should probably be focusing on having better positioning than to rely on this Battlerite to save your life. I talk about the EXQ rather than the Q ability for this Battlerite because generally you'll want to use your EXQ rather than your Q ability because the EX version gives invulnerability but not the base Q ability. So yeah, pick Heartseeker for this tier and you shouldn't go wrong. In the second tier, I think that it will mostly be a choice between Deadly Trap and Panther. Jumong's mouse 2 ability, as I mentioned, isn't that great outside of a few scenarios, and so Power Shot just doesn't cut it with the knockback. The knockback itself doesn't really knock an enemy back very far, and so you're better off using your spacebar and EXQ abilities for survival if you're thinking of using that knockback to knock enemies away, I feel. Maybe you could use the knockback to knock enemies into your trap or your teammates' AoE abilities, but those situations are really niche and I think there are better options for this tier. Deadly Trap makes all your projectiles deal 5 extra damage to enemies routed by your E ability, and this is a pretty big deal I think. The 5 damage extra is a lot and will definitely add up over a long fight, and so it is definitely a must pick if you feel you need more damage. If you're concerned about hitting your E abilities, then you can try incapacitating them with Seeker's Mark first, and this should help you out with it. Hitting your E abilities on enemy champions is much easier, so you should go for that too if you can. If you need more survivability, then Panther is the go-to choice since your EXQ should last 0.5 seconds longer as well, and that will mean more time being invulnerable and moving faster. Very awesome. Moving on, in the third tier, I think that Precision would be the pick most of the time. Precision almost doubles the damage output of Jumong's spacebar ability, and so it helps a lot when you're trying to be aggressive with Jumong's spacebar ability. Picking this Battlerites also unlocks a few different ways of securing the orb, which we'll get to later, and so I think it's definitely the best pick in this tier. If you feel you might need more survivability in a match, then Razor Claws can be pretty good since you can now have the healing buff from walking through enemies with your Q or EXQ abilities. Extra survivability is always handy to me. Do bear in mind that you have to walk through your enemies, so I think Razor Claws is better when your enemies have melee champions since they are more likely to be near enough for you to walk through them. Disabling Trap sounds good in theory, since it makes the trapped enemy very vulnerable and kind of useless, but I think it is overshadowed by the sheer power of Precision and the survivability from Razor Claws, so it's mostly a no-go for me. In the fourth tier, I think that it will be mostly a choice between Marksman and Agility. Marksman makes it so that you're more likely to have 3 weapon charges ready for your recasts, and Agility makes it so that you can kite, poke, and escape easier. And so I think you can pick Marksman if you feel that it might be a bit difficult accumulating those 3 weapon charges, or you can pick Agility for the all-around goodness of extra movement speed. Death Mark isn't really that great since the amount of times you can get Seeker's Mark on enemies is probably around 3 to 4 times at most in a round before one team gets killed completely, and so I think it is just okay. The movement speed from Agility is much better I think, since it gives you benefits all around and not just when you have Seeker's Mark on an enemy. And finally, in the 5th and final tier, I think that Big Game Hunting is probably the better choice between the two. Once you've gotten used to hitting Jumong's mouse once, getting weapon charges isn't that hard, and so Deadeye is just a waste at that point. If you already have 3 weapon charges to begin with, then it is even more of a waste. Big Game Hunting, however, gives you movement and attack speed buffs for a few seconds, and so it is definitely a better pick since all of those buffs just gives you more damage and survivability. Pretty simple choice I think. And so yeah, that's about it on Jumong's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Jumong, as well as some potential combos with him. My first tip for playing Jumong is to take advantage of that long range he has. By now, I've probably mentioned about how big of a deal Jumong's long range is, and so you should definitely try to make full use of it. I often see some Jumong players who doesn't fully utilize his long range and sometimes get too close to enemies. This makes it easier for enemies to attack into Jumong, and so that's not what you want. Perhaps they were not used to hitting his basic attacks yet and want to get closer to the enemy, but even then I think it is definitely worth practicing hitting enemies from as far as you can to really make use of the range. The better you can make use of his range, the bigger the pressure you apply on the enemy by just being there, since they will be afraid that you might just shoot at them and at any time you can hit them for 18 damage, for free. So yes, take advantage of his range. Moving on, another tip I have for playing Jumong is to not hesitate using your spacebar when you need to dodge an important ability, even if your mouse is not in position for your black arrow to hit the enemy. Furthermore, it is also okay to use spacebar even when you don't have 3 weapon charges, so long as you avoid an important ability with it as well. You just gotta make sure that you are ready for whatever happens next, perhaps by preparing your Q to run away when you need to, if in case enemies try to go after you after you've used your spacebar to avoid an ability. Next up, a third tip I have is with aiming with Jumong. Because of his long attack animation, it is not advisable to hold down your mouse one and shoot, since you'll likely mistime quite a few shots this way. It is much better to separately hold and click as though you are drawing the bow and releasing the arrow one at a time, since you get a much better feel for the timing that way. On to some combos with Jumong. The most basic combo that you should know would be the Incapacitate into Trap into R combo. Basically just apply Seeker's Mark on an enemy while escaping with Q or the EX version. preferably it would be EXQ for the invulnerability. Then shoot the target with your mouse 1 or spacebar for the in cap, and just simply put E and R right on top of the enemy. If they don't have an escape cooldown ready, that's a lot of damage right there, since you can then continue to hit them with your mouse 1s after that. Moving on, another basic combo for trying to finish off opponents when you have 3 weapon charges is the mouse 1 followed quickly by spacebar, and then mouse 1 and followed quickly by the second spacebar. If you wait till the end of your mouse 1 cast to take a short moment to aim your spacebar, it will make it significantly easier to hit with your spacebar arrow. I know hitting the spacebar arrow is usually a little tricky, so maybe this tiny tip might help. This combo can deal 52 damage without the tier 3 Battlerites precision, and a massive 64 damage if you picked up precision. Super strong if you manage to hit all 4 arrows, so it's definitely useful to at least know it if in case you need it. After you picked up the precision Battlerites, a good way of picking up the central orb is to mouse 2 onto it first, followed by a mouse 1 and then a quick spacebar onto it. Otherwise, using the aforementioned mouse 1 space combo is a good way to do it as well. Before getting that Battlerites, there's no super quick or elegant way of getting that central orb other than using mouse 2 on it followed by 2 mouse 1s. So yeah, just stick to that I guess before round 3. About teammates, I think that Jumong goes well with other strong ranged or ranged support teammates, since they can either sustain Jumong with heals or put out a lot of pressure on the enemies together with Jumong. Melee champions are good for drawing attention away from Jumong, so that might be good as well, but you'll have to be careful not to let your HP drop too low, since it may be hard to get back some of those health without a proper support teammate. Some good teammates for Jumong in my opinion would be Udyr, Ashka, Taya and Rukhan to name a few. And so overall, I think Jumong is definitely a very strong champion, especially in good hands, since good players will be able to leverage his range, good survivability and control to really make it hard for the enemies to deal with him. He may be a bit awkward to play at first, but practice and eventually he would be able to be a great asset to the team. And so yeah, that's about it for my Jumong guide. I hope you found it useful. I have tallied up the polls on my Rogue guide, and it seems like a Rogue guide will be up next. If you want to vote for which champion guide I would do next after Rogue's guide, you can do so by clicking the I button at the top right now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, keep on gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.